Hello, hello, and welcome to Tea with Halo, the podcast of the Enchanted Academy. I am Halo Quinn, storyteller, author, witch, and general magical creature. And I started this podcast so that you can hear from wonderful and interesting magical folk. Because as a magical practitioner for however many years and a teacher of magic, I'm always curious about how other people engage in their practice, how it evolves in different places, and also as an author, like where people's ideas for books come from, and why people start writing the things that they do and get into the things that they do. So I wanted to bring community together by inviting folks into conversation and to share that then with the wider community. And one of the things that is really, really important to me, and I hope really important to you as well, is the process of re-enchanting the world, or rather remembering that it is enchanted. So with that in mind, today I have asked the marvelous Ben Stimpson to join me and to share some of their work, their play, their practice, and their magic. Ben, please introduce yourself to our listeners.
Of course. Hello, and thank you for having me on, first of all. So my name is Benjamin Stimpson. I'm an author and therapist. And up until, well, 2 weeks of this recording, I was located in Canada, and I'm now located in the United Kingdom. So as a therapist, I align very much with integrative practice. I bring a lot of narrative work in, which also includes mythological cycles and really going into like the spiritual holistic side of connecting with self in various different forms. And as a writer, I focus mostly on spirituality and medieval history and folklore. And I have a recent book, a new book coming out in September called Of Doves and Ravens. And it's all about the magical practitioners of Wales and the borders and the folklore of those people. So, yeah, that's who I am.
Well, I'm really excited to talk to you, and particularly to talk to you about Doves and Ravens, because um, so we first connected when you reached out to me as someone living in Wales, a magical
Mhm.
practitioner and author in Wales, because you were talking about and preparing for coming back over. And so I was very lucky and honoured to be able to read an advanced copy of Doves and Ravens. And it just reads like a love letter to this landscape and to the stories. And like that longing that you had to come back here was really present in your desire
Mhm.
to connect through those tales and the tales of magical people. So
Mhm.
can you tell me a bit about like what inspired you, like what was that impulse that got you to start writing that particular book?
Well, it was originally part of a much larger series, and I originally wrote or started putting it together for another publisher, than the one I'm publishing through right now, and they gave me a lot of leeway with size. So originally, I was very interested in, interested in authentic folklore. Coming from North America, there are so many, how can I say, interesting ideas about what real folklore actually is, especially for Welsh folklore. Um, a lot of people in North America and around the world have heard of, y Mabinogi, but they have not necessarily heard about the more recent folklore, the folklore of the past 400 years, right? The gods of Wales, as someone who wrote a book on the gods of Wales yourself, right? They're very, very, they're known throughout the world, at least people think they know them. Um, and a lot of the interesting ideas that float around, they tend to come from, the 1990s, a lot of people connecting with their Welsh heritage or their British heritage, and intuiting things because they believed that there was a lack of information. And so when I looked at the corpus of folklore material from Wales, I think what really struck me and what really implanted into me a necessity to be very careful and to approach it with respect is that the folklore material itself was put together by Welsh nationalists and individuals who were very interested in securing Welsh identity and securing Welsh cultural heritage in the face of oppression from England, so and the English authorities. So, you can really get that sense diving into the authentic Welsh traditional texts. Now, I was also mostly kind of in a way disabled in a sense because I only speak English. I'm not fluent in Cymraeg, but I have enough Cymraeg that I can somewhat, open the book and know what it's about. But the majority of my Cymraeg is very, very limited. So there's a huge aspect that is even closed to me. And if, most North Americans don't have Cymraeg either. So there's a huge number of figures and individuals and beings that are only spoken about in English with a few sentences. Some of our friends and colleagues in Wales and outside of Wales who are doing a lot of good work, like Mara and Brett and Moss, Christopher Hughes, and quite a few of the other writers. They're doing a really good work to bring that material into English, but it's still very unknown. So I wanted to put together a kind of a collection of information about these individuals, like focusing on the stories as opposed to trying to place them into a historical narrative. Other writers have done a really wonderful job with that. So I felt like that wasn't my task. My task was really to focus in on the actual folklore, because in paganism and traditional witchcraft, a lot of people are really driven by that folklore to engage with their practice. They're using that as the source material to develop their historiola, right? And to develop their craft. So I wanted to put something together, and I was also a little sick of the ancestors because I'd been speaking about the ancestors for many, many, many years beforehand. So yeah, that's how the book came about.
One of the things that's interesting there is that actually there's a lot of, you could almost say that it was a text of ancestral stories
Mhm.
because a lot of
Yeah,
of what we call folklore, they're tales about people who actually lived in actual
exactly.
places.
Yes, very much so. And this is one of the three major ingredients for folklore that I feel like modern people often don't understand, is that folklore was traditionally always connected to place. This idea that folk tales exist in some mythical, other place, out of time, is really a product of the Victorian academics, right? If we look at if we look at the Brothers Grimm, for example,
Mm.
right, or Hans Christian Andersen, these are tales that are very familiar to us because of Disney, because of like fairy tale books, right? But when you actually look at them, those tales were originally connected to places in Germany and to in Denmark. And those locations were stripped away because there was a desire to seek out universality, right? Which is there. I'm not arguing against that. But I think if you strip away the location that these tales are connected to, you're also stripping away one of the three major ingredients, which is location, face, and story, right? That make these tales memorable, that make these tales less stories that can just be, you know, overlooked and more tales that you can enter into because you're entering into their landscapes.
Yeah. And that's, so there's a few different pieces in there. One is that desire to take those folk tales and decontextualize them so that they can be offered to people in other places, right?
Mhm,
But there's also, it feels to me like there's a parallel here with the kind of, the word's gone out of my head, where we have the whole world is connected, right? And so
mhm,
we're as individuals, and this has been happening for the past couple of hundred years, right? We've become
mhm,
less connected to place as individuals, as families,
mhm,
because we've been able to move. We've been encouraged to move into cities, and there's some glorious things that allow us to connect like we
mhm,
are doing now, across hundreds of miles and
mhm,
across the world and across oceans. But then when we go to share our stories, if the folk tales are rooted in specific places, we'll find similar stories often in different locales that have similar types of landscape, and we'll
Mm,
find similar motifs. But that doesn't mean that they're like the same thing, that we can abstract it out.
mhm.
Um, what's the word? It's a globalization.
Globalization, yes.
That's the word I was looking for.
Yes.
So there's kind of, it feels like there's a sort of globalization vibe. And because we're so used to living in a world where we're all interconnected and where we think of everything as being interchangeable and where,
Hmm.
it seems perfectly natural to us today
Hmm.
to read stories that aren't rooted in a specific place, or that
Hmm.
um, one of my favorite examples of this is Thomas the Rhymer. It's one of my favorite stories,
Yes.
right? Border ballads, so the border of Scotland and England from a specific set piece of time, place and time.
Hmm.
Um, and Thomas of Ercildown, an actual person, right? Historical
Hmm.
person. And the ballads, the romances say he was under the Eildon tree.
Hmm.
Now, when I was first told this story, I was told, oh, Eildon tree, that means a hawthorn tree.
Mm.
But actually, the Eildon tree is a specific tree. It's a specific landmark in that landscape. And it
Hmm.
probably wasn't even a hawthorn species wise,
Mm.
right? So, like, there's that really interesting thing that happens when we take these stories out of place, when we share them in places where people don't know that landscape, they can't keep those
Hmm.
pieces.
Yeah.
So, what's the benefit then, do you think, of sharing stories from other landscapes and learning stories from other landscapes? Like, what would be the point of someone in North America reading, well, your book on very place rooted
Yeah.
stories?
I mean, this is the issue, right? Because the trend over the past even 150 years, 200 years, has actually been anathema to how humans usually connect with story throughout time. And I say that as somebody who comes from a comparative mythology background, right? Really diving into these stories and seeing how the same story manifests in different places, but slightly different to fit into those different communities. It taught me a great deal about the human brain and how humanity like connects with story. Because the trend is that, and this is why these stories get shared so much, like across country boundaries, across continents, right? Why we have these motifs in the first place isn't that they're universal and so will pop up just again and again and again. It's that as they are being shared, it's almost viral in that they are adopted by communities because there is something in that story that is useful to the group identity. It connects with the history of that place. It somehow is useful to the hive mind of that community, right? And so then it gets adopted, and what happens is it gets landed because it needs to be landed, because it needs to be assimilated into that space. And if it doesn't do that, then it's still something other, foreign, right? It isn't our story anymore. It's not our story to begin with, right? When something becomes our story, it might be related to, like in witches' stories, for example, you know, the story here might be similar to the one just in the next village, but she's not the witch from the next village. She's our witch, and she lives here, and that's the hovel that she used to live in, and that's the ruin that was you have to stay away from, and that's she's here. She's in our environment. She's not over there. She's here. So we need to be careful here, right? And I think that is fundamentally why stories keep manifesting over and over and over again, is because they are useful, right? They get attached to figures that are here versus over there. And if they are over there, then there's a reason why communities here that story connected over there, right? So a very good example of this is the Jack stories, which are originate, and people in England and UK here will know them very well. They originate from the West Country. And they became such a valuable thing in Appalachia over in North America that you now can find Jack stories over there landed into that landscape, throughout the mountains and throughout the Ozarks, that died out in Britain. That they no longer are told over here. There's no connection, there's no trace of them anymore. But they did originate over in Britain, and they were transported with those migrants, and they became landed. Jack is no longer connected to, that mountain or that Gromlech in Devon. He's connected to that mountain or that overpass in Georgia or in North Carolina or somewhere, right, just outside of Asheville, whatever it is, right? So Jack then exists, even though he came from over there, he now exists here, and he's accessible. And when we look at the kind of the mythology, the traditions of like ancient Greece, of any country in the world, you will eventually see that orthodoxy does not exist, that you have regionalism, right? Zeus is not born just here, he's born here and here and here and over there because those stories make Zeus accessible, right? If you go to ancient Greece, there will be there'll be openings to Hades all over the place because they make Hades accessible, right? The trend to orthodoxy, this trend to this is the right story, this is the correct story, tends to be when you get into larger and larger and larger regional zones, in which case then regionalism can't exist in the same way. It gets pushed down into folklore. It gets pushed down into superstition. It gets pushed down in favor of this regional view. And at that point, then you just have one version, and one version is correct, right? So I think to answer your question long-winded way, the reason that people want to know this information in North America about stories in Wales or stories in Britain is because first of all, they don't have access to those stories because those stories didn't come with them or are not in their places of origin in North America, but also because they're privileging this landscape over here with a certain feeling, a certain connection, a certain relationship that they don't feel in their landscapes. But if you go down to Appalachia and speak to any of the old granny practitioners, they don't need the stories that are housed over in Britain. They just sing them themselves, right? There are so many English ballads that have survived in Appalachia that are completely now assimilated to that space and place. They're no longer, using fiddles, they're using the banjo to play them, right? And to them, it's like, well, no, these are the stories of our people. Oh, you have them too? That's great. Come and sing them with us.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I like that. It's that really important thing that listening to or reading, as we do so often now, the stories of other places gives
Mhm.
us a sense of those places, but it also reveals stories that speak to us, right?
Mhm.
And that we can relate to. And so what I'm hearing you say is like when we privilege the stories of another country that we're not in, of another landscape that we're not in, and we romanticize it, well, that's a problem because we're
Mhm.
forgetting to land ourselves.
Yes.
But if we don't have those stories in the place that we're in, or we don't know them, then we might find one route to discover them by looking at the local stories in other places. Yeah. Also,
Yeah.
we're nosy buggers.
Well, we're also nosy buggers too, yes. But I mean, I didn't want to talk about them, but we're going to have to talk about them, right? A lot of people, especially in neo-paganism, are really connected with ancestors and ancestral story, right? So they are looking and wanting to practice the ways of their ancestors because, especially in North America, of that disconnection, right? Settler culture in North America, has obliterated and made space for itself, and a lot of things are not organically settled, right? A lot of people in North America whose families have been there 200 or 300 years still don't feel like this is the land of their ancestors, right? Oh, the old country is the land of the ancestors, and that can be spoken for most of the immigrant groups. Um, and it became for some groups it can become very, especially neo-paganism, it can become very, um, what can I say? I'm treading lightly here so I don't miss anybody. But I think that it can become very unhealthy. It can be very healthy, but it can also become very unhealthy in how those stories are taken up. Because oftentimes those stories they exist for diaspora people in a third space, whereas the people over here in this landscape, those stories are no longer, they're not in a third space, right? Look at, Imavanagi, right? They're not in some mystical otherworld. They're literally at the lakefront in Bala. You can go to Inismon and see the heartstone that was Branwen's heart broken in half, right? You can go to Gwyneth and you can see, the stone that, Lle threw his spear through to kill Granwell. Granur?
Ronu.
I'm Granu. That's it. Thank you,
That's how
thank you, thank
I
you.
understand the pronunciation. Yeah.
30 years away from Wales, just saying. I'm just saying. If anybody's like hating me for that, 30 years away from Wales, just saying.
Yeah.
But the point stands, right? It's in the landscape.
Yeah.
A friend of mine went to Iceland a few years ago, and they went to a blot that one of the heathen groups was putting on there. I think the main heathen organization was putting it on, and people were showing up in pajamas. People were in pajama bottoms, and and my friend was shocked by that because in North America you get dressed up, you get in your furs, you put on your face paint, you do whatever it is, and they were just showing up because it was normal for them,
Yeah.
right? It's in the landscape. We don't need, it's not a third space. So I think that that can be the danger sometimes. And so with my book in particular, it was really important, not only for people in Wales, but especially for people outside of Wales, to connect these stories to place.
Mm.
Because then, if people know that these stories are not just in a mythical zone, they can actually go to these places.
Yeah.
One of my favorite and I mean, there's so much written about him. He's one of the most celebrated Dyn Hospice cunning men in Wales, Dr. Harry's of Curtigadno. And I mean, a huge number of stories. I was able to find like dozens of stories connected to him. Many of them were stock stories, but many of them were also, like historical what you call it, attestations and anecdotes and things like that. And he was quite the character, right? But you can actually go to where he came from. You can go to the village where it was his. You can see his house. I mean, it's privately owned. You don't have right to go up there to it, but you
No,
can see
don't
the
try and walk in.
landscape,
Yeah.
right? Yeah.
Yeah.
You can see it. So you enter into the story then in a way that you're not able to necessarily do
Mm.
unless, of course, you do ritual work to enter a story or go to a play and enter the story that way. The fourth wall still exists for you. But if you go into the landscape, the fourth wall just disappears.
Yeah. It's one of the things that I sometimes talk about is when I first encountered the story of Ceridwen and Taliesin, I was in southwest England. Okay, I was near Glastonbury. In fact, I was in that landscape. Now that's
Okay.
very close to Wales, but
Yes.
it isn't that area where the story of that section of Hanes Taliesin comes from. Um,
Yes.
as you say, up in Bala, Llyntegid, that lake there, right? And when you come up into this area of Wales, I live in Aberystwyth, which is just down the coast from where Taliesin is said to have landed and been pulled out of the water and come to land and emerged into the world as a bard.
Yes.
And I can feel their presence in this land.
Yes.
Now, when I work with the story as a myth, knowing that it's rooted in landscape, when I worked with it in my teens in a slightly different landscape, I could feel them as deities. I could feel their presence. I could feel their magic. Like those beings, they will travel. And the story like can travel beyond that landscape. But when I came into this landscape and came home here, because
Mhm.
very much like crossed over the border and landed in mid Wales and went, oh no, I belong to this land, right?
Mhm. Mhm.
I met those deities in the landscape, those
Mhm.
beings in the landscape, those magics in the landscape, but they were less anthropomorphic, they were less human,
Yes.
they were more encompassing, more like the magic
Hmm.
behind them, and just more present throughout.
Yes.
And so there's that slightly different relationship when you're in diaspora, or if you're working with a story from somewhere else,
Yeah.
than when you're working with it in the landscape.
It's true. And it's true. And it's, it's something that I think it's something that, again, is an anomaly in the world because, the past 200 years, when you really look at the vast amount of time and how most cultures, and I say most cultures specifically because I've done the groundwork to actually try to understand and study, um, you know, the the majority of deities and spirits and whatnot have been grounded in two places, right? And that's why indigenous cultures are so connected to their homelands. They're so connected to place and space, and why, like changing names is such a horrific thing, right? In Wales in particular, and you know this, I mean, I don't need to tell you this, but for the benefit of our listeners, right, there is a real trend to bring back Welsh names that were changed or overshadowed by English. And, as somebody who, although I can't speak Welsh, I have a great deal of respect for Welsh language and Welsh speaking culture. That's a huge thing. But it's the same in North America, right? The number is same in New Zealand, in so-called New Zealand, in so-called Australia, right? Any colonized land, the names, and I make this point in the book, place names are some of the hardest things to change because once they get in here, you will call it and associate it with that name. And oftentimes, place names will retain information that has been lost,
Yeah,
right? So, the different communities have had to deal with diaspora issues in their own different ways. Um, for many, many years I was connected with the Lukumi tradition, and I lived with my godfather. And Lukumi is one of the branch of kind of children of Yoruba tradition, the slaves who brought over on the Middle Passage to Cuba. In the same way, the slaves from the Yoruba region were brought to Brazil and to other areas around the Caribbean. Many of them retained their traditional knowledge and their spiritual lineage. And in Cuba, at least, the Santeros or Santeras, who were really called Aloshas and Aloshas and Olorishas, priests, they were able to continue their practices, modify them to that landscape, but they are still spiritually connected to Yoruba land. So whenever you have a priest of Oshun, for example, it's a diaspora tradition. It's a household tradition. There's no temples because the shrines are located in the household. But there are certain instruments and certain things inside their pots that are linked almost like touch relics all the way back to the original like Oshun pot in Yoruba land in Nigeria, right, from 300, 400 years ago, right? That's how they were able to survive. But the stories have shifted so that the stories are no longer so connected to Yoruba land that they became impossible to practice, right? They became more mobile, but there were checks and balances. In Nigeria, if you want to connect with any of those Orisha, you go to the places that they are the manifestation of. Oshun is the embodiment of a particular river in Nigeria. Same with Ogun, same with Yamaya, right? But in Cuba, those spirits had to shift and change so that they were adaptive to that landscape. And now they are adaptive to the shrine. So the shrine becomes a mini microcosm of the world. It's set up in a particular way. The spirits that dwell within that shrine are living within a certain microcosm, and it has to be kind of set up and worked with in a certain way. But it becomes the landscape that you connect with. It is a landscape, right? So when you look at it, you can see the stories of those spirits within that shrine. And I think I would say that that's indicative of many, many traditions around the world. Certainly ancient Greece, when the deities were no longer just the god of the mountain, the god of the sky, the god of wherever, when they became temple deities, the temples became a mini microcosm, right? It became a landscape. We see this with Catholicism too, right? Whenever you enter into a Catholic church, like an old style Catholic church, none of this Vatican II nonsense. But when you enter into a real, like, say real Catholic church, I'm sorry, that's really dismissive. When you enter into a Catholic church and you see the Stations of the Cross on the wall, what are you actually, or what are Catholic practitioners doing? They are walking the landscape of Jerusalem, right? Right, going and visiting each of those shrines, right? So it is a landscape, and you're connecting to story through that proxy landscape, right?
This is making me think of what we do within neo-paganism, modern day paganism, right?
Yep.
Is when we cast our circle, and we do the like we call the quarters, or we work with the elements in those quarters. And in some groups, you'll work with like the sky and the sea and the land, right? That triplicity, or so there's
Mm-hmm.
slightly different ways of doing it. And of course, the quartered circle comes from a ceremonial magic model, like
Mm-hmm.
that's got roots in there, and then it's come to us via various places. We use it because it works. And I'm thinking, yeah, that what we're doing there is mapping out and orientating ourselves within the world.
Mm-hmm.
We're creating a microcosm of the universe.
Yes.
Yeah. And that,
Yeah.
like, I consciously, like, I do that deliberately, that as a, like, this is a microcosm of the
Mm-hmm.
universe. It's both outside of the world and holographic part of all of it, etc., etc. But I hadn't actually thought about it before in relation to making space for those deities that are rooted in the land to come and be there.
Yes.
One of the things that's also parallel to this that I've wondered about before is that when we are when we live on a land and we eat food from the land, we breathe in the air, we are
Mm-hmm.
actually taking in part of that landscape.
Mm-hmm.
So one, we've got the like, this is slightly iffy ground, right? To talk about, you've got to be careful talking about this.
Mm-hmm.
But if you live in a place and you root into that place, you then become part of you becomes part of that. But you also carry everything like epigenetics and genetics and blood,
Mm-hmm.
like bone, like you carry all of the land that your ancestors have
Mm-hmm.
had as part of them. And so there's there's this piece someone once asked me, and like I'm not the person to give permission by any means. I grew up in England, moved to Wales. I like, you know, but they're like, do I have a right to work with, like, what right do I have to work with Ceridwen, if I don't, I'm not Welsh and I don't come from Wales? And I'm like, well, one, if she wants to work with you, like, she's her own person. She can do what she likes. She can work with who she wants to work with, right? So if she calls you, she calls you.
Mm-hmm.
Two, if you have a connection to that landscape where her home is, if you live here, if you eat here, even
Mm-hmm.
if you visit here and you feel that connection, like,
Mm-hmm.
your body is connected to that physicality of the dirt of this landscape.
Yes.
Um, and three, I mean, people share,
Mm-hmm.
and we share through that connection. Now, this isn't, obviously, I want to just say this to be very, very clear. There are closed traditions, there are closed
There are.
practices.
Mm-hmm.
It is possible to be a horribly white colonizer about this. And I've got to
Mm-hmm.
be really careful to go and just sort of nick things from people, or to set yourself up as like, I get to gatekeep this or whatever. And like, all of these things are possible. And a connection to a tradition, a connection to a specific being, a
Mm-hmm.
spirit, a deity, isn't necessarily one of ancestry that you know about,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Yep, it's true. I agree with everything you just said. No qualms with it. But this is where, like, I think this is where the danger is, right? Because, you know, so many people in our communities are interested in what other people are doing, because they are either not connected with what their cultural background is, or there's a seeking there, but the seeking is not known what they're looking for, right? And hold my hands up, right? I was one of those people too. I've been very lucky that I've been welcomed into spaces that I was not born into. Um, and at the same time, I've also kind of understood and been allowed to understand a great deal of how many of those traditions work and welcome new people in, because the reality is that a lot of these traditions didn't have to deal with new influx of people. Again, the past 200 years has been an anomaly,
Mm.
right? Globalization is not a natural thing for the way that the world has functioned for thousands of years. Yes, war and colonization and has definitely existed, and definitely has definitely existed, but it hasn't been to the same extent and scale as the past 200 years here, right? So when it comes to, you know, inviting people in, and sharing and teaching them. A lot of traditions around the world that I've heard from and seen and had the joy of sharing space with, they're forming those connections as well. But there's also this idea of what those traditions are, which people may or may not have grounded in reality, right? I remember watching this documentary, and it was shamans in Buryatia in Russia, in just north of Mongolia. And it was an initiation of a shaman because basically the spirits were saving her life. She was going to die, and so the spirits came in to save her life. But the cost of that was that she had to become a shaman and serve them. That was the cost. She could decide she didn't want to do that, and then they would just let her die, and then that was it. So so she went through, and she was healed from whatever it was that she had that was causing her issues. And she said, I keep hearing all these people from Moscow come and wanting to, initiate to be a shaman. And I don't understand why. Like, I would not want this on my worst enemy because of the amount of dedication, the amount of time, the amount of energy, the sacrifices that you have to make, right? And I would say that that's pretty conclusive around the world. Certainly in Lukumi, there were priests who are made, many priests who are made because the Orishas say, you're going to die if you don't. So we'll save you, but you're going to have to become one of our priests and dedicate yourself. And, being a priest in an African tradition is a very full-time job, right? It is every single day. You've got these 15 or 16 Orisha that every single one of them has to be taken care of. And you also have to, fulfill your own destiny in that. So it's like that cultural appropriation piece often has that layer of kind of Western individualistic capitalism, right? And I know you know this. I'm not mansplaining this to you, but for the benefit of our readers. But like I mean, the past 200 years, that has been there's an Orthodox Christianity, not Orthodox like Orthodox,
There's an
but like
orthodoxy.
there's an orthodoxy, yes, mostly Protestantism. So Protestantism, capitalism, and individualism, those three things have really come together and just gone on and on and on. And we see this in neo-paganism all the time, right?
And
This idea of, yeah, sorry, go on.
that bit of spiritual tourism as well, because we're seeking meaning.
Yeah.
And
What
that,
can you do for me? Right?
yeah, but like also there's this really interesting tension, right? So,
Mm,
and I'll no shade on the Wiccans, but I do blame Gerald Gardner for this.
mhm.
Um, and that's that everyone can be
Mhm.
their own priest or priestess, right?
Yes.
So every magical practitioner, every person, and we adopted this into paganism, and this
Mhm.
idea that every single person who wants to be a pagan also is a magical practitioner and a
Right.
priest, priestess, priestess, right? A
Mhm.
ritualist, you know, like everyone has to be all of these things. And actually, we don't.
No.
So we don't all have to be shamans in,
No.
to use the term as we understand it as a common thing rather than as a culturally
Mm.
specific thing, right? We don't all have to be in that space. And in fact, as you say, it's quite hard work and it can be very, very
It
lonely.
is. Yes, it
Uh,
is.
yeah, like my partner once said to me something, oh, your primary partner is like, and I was like, no, actually, he was talking about something that I really love to do, and I said, no, actually, thinking about it, my primary partner, if you think about like polyamorous
Hmm.
relationships, right? So he's my primary human partner.
Mm.
Is my human, I'm not really, I don't have time for multiple human partners because my primary partner in life is magic.
Mm.
And that means I spend an awful lot of time doing magic, working with magic,
Hmm.
writing about magic, exploring magic, finding myself pulled down different rabbit holes and drawn into
Mm.
different places and connecting with different spirits and deities and going, but I can't, like, why are you, like, I can't add another person
Hmm.
onto my altar. I've run out of space.
Yeah.
And it's kind of actually it's overwhelming and it's unnecessary for most
Hmm.
people, right?
Yes.
Um, now
Yes.
I've gotten to a point, and I'm sure like many people have got get to a point of going, oh, okay, right, these are relationships, and sometimes
Yes.
they're brief relationships, and so it's you need to
Hmm.
work with them when they're there and move on from
Hmm.
it. But it's actually like it's completely unnecessary for
Hmm.
someone to do all of those things. We have specialists that do these things for a
Hmm.
reason. And
Yes.
part of my, what was it you said, to fulfill your own destiny as well as looking after these deities, like part of my destiny as I understand it is bringing some of these threads together, sharing those stories, right?
Mm.
I don't know, like, I'm working on it. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe
Hmm.
I'm gonna get led down different paths or whatever. But this is part of my personal work.
Hmm. Hmm.
It's not, and it shouldn't be part of everyone's work.
No. And people try to be everything, right?
Hmm.
People try to be everything because that individualism, and particularly in North America, has gotten so bad that people who are trying to flee from kind of evangelical Christianity and that really Protestant, like hardcore Protestant mentality, even people who are fleeing into neo-paganism, and I
Yeah,
say fleeing very particularly here, right, are still believing because of that cultural landscape that they come from, that they have to be everything. So they have to be a witch, they have to be a magic practitioner, they have to be a devotee of all of these deities, they have to be this, they have to be that, in order to feel solid in themselves. And again, that's an anomaly because community collectivism is really the norm throughout the world and has been for thousands and thousands of years, right? Individualism is really very much a modern thing that has evolved. And it's actually individualism that has caused many of the older stories to die out because
yeah,
people have had to leave or they moved away from their home areas and they didn't pick up those stories and the stories were not told again. And so many of those stories were lost because the people who were kind of the designated storytellers in those regions died out without telling and giving those stories down,
yeah.
right? Yeah.
There's do you know I imagine you know Jenny Blaine's work. It's within heathenry. She writes within heathenry.
I actually don't. I could sit here and pretend and lie, but I'm not going to do
But
that.
she's brilliant. Lives in Scotland and writes and talks and teaches. She's a lecturer on heathenry, and she's got this beautiful book, and the name of it escapes me. No, it's not visible. I think it's trolls, whites, elves, and trolls, or something similar. But basically, it's talking about general heathen belief. So
Mm,
this is one particular culture heathenry, or it's
mm,
actually several, right? Because it spans across lots of the Northern European countries, and
yes.
right. So most of the people who were heathens historically would not have necessarily worked, they wouldn't have worked with specific deities, they wouldn't have been a priest of a deity, they wouldn't have been had the deity as their patron. Their everyday belief and everyday practice and everyday magic
Hmm.
would have actually just been in relationship with the spirits of the land and the spirits of their ancestors. And
Very much so.
yeah, and occasionally, like someone in the household might have kept the household shrine, whoever the head of the household was, might have kept the household shrine and like made offerings once a week or whatever to keep the household gods happy. Um, but most people, you just get on with your life. And so, in order to be pagan, even a neo pagan, like we can have a deity that we're close to, and
Hmm.
that can be really nice. But our general overarching practice for pagan belief is about that relationship with the land and with the world and with the
Hmm.
spirits of community and with our community. And how can we
Yes.
be in community?
Very much so, right? And that community is a really important piece here, right? I'm going to say something a little controversial here. I'm going to say that I think neo-paganism is not set up intrinsically to form solid communities. First of all, a lot of people came from online, I myself included. A lot of people found these through online spaces, and and so online communities have very different realities to physical communities. Um, there's a certain form of, in a way, capitalism to it, right? Right? We see it when we go to pagan festivals. There are people selling themselves, selling their services, selling their wares, and there's nothing wrong with that.
Yeah.
But so much of so many of the early books were like, you have to be this, you have to be that, you have to be that, you have to be that, right? And I mean, certainly some of the early writers were very much, and say when I say early writers, I mean early writers to me. So like in the 1990s and the early 2000s, right? It was like make money, get rich quick, sell your services, right? And so there's a certain commodification of these practices. And in order to do that, you have to be a bigger than life person. You have to be the witch of blah blah blah, or you have to be the fortune teller of da da da, right? Whatever it is. So when I hear people talk about creating community, I really wonder, what does that mean to you? Is community getting together every couple of months at a festival and, worshipping the moon around a campfire? I've done it. I love it. It's nothing, it's nothing that I haven't engaged with myself. But again, it's that idea of what is community. Now,
Mm.
that being said, there are fabulous communities out there. There are fabulous organizations, fabulous individuals who are creating really strong, solid communities. But I would almost caution that when we look at those groups versus the more flashier types, a lot of people are going to be connected to those flashier types, right? And so it's that idea of what is community. Also, this idea, and you raised a good point about, the living your life, right? If we look at lived practice now in other traditions, Hinduism, Buddhism, Christianity, Islam, whatever it is, whatever tradition is out there, you have a certain kind of lived experience which is normal. You go to, pray in the church. Down in Northampton here, a friend of mine took me into St. Giles Church in the center of town and told me about his little ritual of going and sitting down and praying, and took me around the church and showed me all the historical pieces, right? And and he was practicing witch too. It's just his life, right? Just on
Mm.
his lunch break, he goes, lights a candle, says a prayer, and comes out and goes and have, lunch, right? I think I don't think that that's lacking, but I do think that it's not talked about enough. Is that you can have relationship with deities, but it doesn't have to be flashy. It can be run of the mill because they are integrated into your life, right? And I
Yeah.
certainly respect like my own deities in that way. I have a certain pantheon of deities that I work with, and those deities are in my life because they've always been in my life, right? Some of them are deities of change because change has been such a huge aspect of and kind of a foundational mover and shaker in my life, right? I have a tattoo of Web of Weird on my right where I can see it, because fate and the deities of fate are really important to me. And I work with them every day. I have a felt sense about them and their presence in my life. but I can be on the toilet and feel that movement too, right? Not that movement, like general movement,
Do you know,
and it's
fun
just normal.
and funnily enough, I know that there are practices that you can do with that kind of movement while you're sat on the toilet that are relating
True.
into working with the dragon that gnaws on the roots of
Oh,
the world tree, and the deities of waste and removal.
it's true.
Interesting
Yeah.
thing that apparently Venus is also a deity of, or was a deity of sewers as well. I
Hmm.
remember reading somewhere, as well as funeral directors,
Oh,
on top of like all of the usual love and what have you that we think of. Yeah, also that, and that may well be because that's part of life, right?
yes, it is.
And
Yeah.
that piece that you're talking about as well, like what is community and how does that differ in different places? One of the problems I think that we have within paganism, within modern paganism, and of course I'm talking about within Western spaces, the
Hmm.
spaces I know,
Yeah.
is that our whole world is set up on a capitalist and individualist
Yes.
model, right? As you say. And what that means is, in order to have a space for people to meet, in order to have the
Mhm.
structure that supports a community, you have to pay for it.
Yes.
And because we are a disparate collective of many, many different traditions and many different people, and we're quite spread out, honestly,
Yes. Yes.
finding the ways in which you find the funds to pay for the structure. So I'll give you an example, right? Me and a friend of mine, we run the local moot. So we meet once a month and we do a ritual for each of the festivals. And we do this, it's all co-created, it's very egalitarian. And basically by run it, I just mean that he or I will send out a reminder to people of, we're meeting in this place at this time. Don't forget. Oh, you need a lift. This person's coming from where you're coming from. Let's like connect you up. Right. So we'll do that. We'll find a venue and what have you. We found a really lovely hall that was perfect. But the problem was we needed to pay for it.
Yes.
And it was fine when we had 5 people turn up for a ritual. But when it was the winter solstice and everyone was ill and one person turned up, the usual method of everyone putting a couple of quid in the pot and that covering it, hopefully, didn't
Mhm.
work.
No.
So someone had to be managing the money. Someone had to be managing the like paying the venue and booking the venue. And someone needed to take the hit when that wasn't covered by the community, because we didn't have a structure in place for it.
Yeah.
And so back in the 90s, there are quite a lot of little witchy shops with back rooms opened up, right? Now
Yeah.
we've lost that because of the internet and because of
Yeah,
the
we have.
pandemic, and everyone's moved online, and we've lost those back rooms, which means that we often don't, it's hard to find pagan friendly spaces to even hire, even if you do have the cash. So you've got that aspect of it, in that, and I run an online community, the Enchanted
Mhm.
Academy, and I host multiple online circles for free that people can come along to.
Mm.
But in order to do that, even though it's like, okay, it's online. What are the costs involved? Well, there's the cost of Zoom, there's the cost of the space, there's the time putting into these things, like all of those things, right? So all of those things are costs that I am paying in order to make that space happen.
Yes.
So to support that, and then like, okay, so I've got to then sell things.
Exactly.
And in order to do that, I've got to be flashy about it, or I've got to find some way, right?
Exactly.
And this is why we end up with the kind of the flashy people running spaces that are very commercial, and they continue, and it's really hard to have the time, the energy, the
Mm.
money, the mental health,
Yes.
and for the community to actually appreciate that enough to invest in it with their time and sometimes donations in order to actually build that together.
Yes.
So this is one of the spaces I am quite envious of, Christian priests, that they
Very much
have
so.
a
Yes.
church and they are paid to actually like look after people and to learn the skills that they need and to be in that role. Um, but yeah, so it's that. So how do we navigate that aspect of
This is the
things
thing, right?
in
This is
building?
the thing.
Yeah,
Yeah. Well, and
building.
this is the thing.
Yeah,
Sorry, go on.
I was going to say I'm building anti-capitalist spaces and building right,
Well,
non-hierarchical, coming back to the land, all of these things as well, because many of us want that.
but this is the thing, and I guess I don't want to sound too critical because I am a part of a community. You know, often sometimes when I get critical, um I get accused of being an outsider, an interloper. But no, this is me speaking as somebody in the community, right? And I don't want to sound critical because I think that a lot of people are doing the best that they can do. I think what's intrinsically difficult though is that you know there is a there is a capitalist undercurrent in the very fabric of even how people learn, right?
Yeah,
And I say this as an author, and you're an author too, and we're both published by an author by a publisher that makes money off of books, right? And specifically books that get, a lot of new books coming out every year. I feel like even how we learn about our traditions, even how we learn about these identities that we're taking on for ourselves or trying on for ourselves, these communities that we're wanting to be in. There is so many there's so many facets of getting the right information, buying the right books, getting the tools, getting the clothing, getting the this, getting that, really taking on something. And in a lot of traditions, people are born into the traditions, and it's just a natural part of their culture, right? So I feel like we're getting there, and I think that we're seeing differences. I'm certainly noticing differences in how, in Britain, the various traditions are playing out, and in North America, how the different traditions are playing out. In Britain, I'm really noticing that people come together like in pubs, right? That is a very normal thing. You just go to the pub. So why not have a pub moot, right? Why not get together with friends in the pub and talk about these things? I would say, that's a very normal kind of living aspect of the culture.
yeah,
That's religion in normality, right?
yeah,
Whereas in North America, that's not a normal thing. You don't go to the sports bar to talk about spirituality, you know. No, you go to a temple, you
yeah,
go to a thing, you go to something, right? Plus, the distances are huge too in North America. So, I certainly, I've appreciated that. Like there was Convocation, which was just down in Michigan. It was 4 hours away from me, but there was a border in between, so I saw like people like Matt Oren and Devin Hunter and David Salisbury and all these lovely, delicious people coming together. And I'm like over the border waving at them because I can't get down there. Oh, but it is one of those things, right?
yeah,
So I guess when you look at like coming back to the stories and that idea of the folklore, right? The stories reflect living life. That's how they evolve and change so that they're updated too. But we had a break about 120 years ago. Suddenly, a lot of our folklore is now in the past tense versus in the present tense, in the same way that a lot of paganism is in the past tense and not the present tense, right? Christians, Muslims, Buddhists, Hindus, they don't think in the past tense, they think in the present tense. I'm going to go to temple because they have the infrastructure, right? So I feel like if we had a focus on what is the infrastructure that brings it into the present tense. And at that point, then it's looking at lived practice. What are you doing at your home? What are you doing in your day, your regular goings about, right? I went to the Rollright Stones with a friend this past week, whenever it was. I've only been here in the country 2 weeks, so it's sometime in the past 2 weeks. Don't ask me when, but it was so weird for me as somebody who is effectively a North American coming to a place I've never been to, but I've seen a lot of pictures of them, and suddenly they're there, and we wandered about, and we had a sandwich, and we were just looking at the stones, and it was like in and out of reality. The fourth wall was dissolved. I know the story of the Whispering Knights. I know the story of the king. I know the story of the witch that turned them all into stone, right? But to be there in that place felt so normal. And I think that's the divide between North America and here, is that a lot of people here, it's normal to go to Avebury, to go to Glastonbury to experience the landscape. Whereas over in North America, this landscape is in third place, right?
That's really interesting. I mean,
Yeah.
I grew up a 20-minute bus journey from
Ah,
Avebury. So like I used to go there, but probably about once a month throughout my
yeah.
childhood, and we just go and climb on the stones, which you're not meant to do. But
No.
like,
Yeah.
we're kids. Of course we climbed on the
Yeah.
stones and
Of
rolled down
course
the
you did.
hills
Yeah.
and.
Yeah.
And I found it very magical because it was a beautiful, interesting place, and I've always resonated with the magic in places and the fair
Yes.
folk in particular.
Yeah.
But it was just like people were just there. It was a historical site, or it is a historical site. People were just there going, "Oh, this is a nice day out. We're having a
Yeah.
picnic." Um, so yeah, like here, and that I think you're right that there's a couple of things going on. One is that commercialization of it.
Mhm.
Another is the we think of paganism as being and our deities as being from the past, and so in order to get it right, we've got to do it as they would have done it in the past.
Yeah.
And we've got that thing of going, well, spirituality has to be special, and so it has to be at the temple. It
Mhm.
can't just be that you're talking to Rod as you walk along the seafront, right? You can't just have a natter with Caridwen as the night comes over because she's there. Like, but you can.
You can. Oh, you can, right? Because they're not just personified stories. They're forces of nature, right? They're they're experienceable. And I think this is also probably the Protestant idea, like kind of seeping into our culture here, is that anthropomorphization has really stripped our connection. And I say that carefully because I think a lot of people are connecting. They're they're coming to these conclusions themselves. They may not have the language because we don't have the language with this clumsy language of human speech that we try to experience the world through, or to explain the world through. But that experience of that felt sense of, you know, with the stories and how they apply to our lives. I was working with a client, and I won't talk too much for confidentiality, of course, but I was working with a client who was very interested in the story of Ceridwen and was very connected with her because of the story of a part of the story where she was trying to help her son. And as we worked through, she really started to realize that her life was much more like Taliesin, right? Ceridwen wasn't a vengeful mother to her. She was a strict mother to her because, throughout her life, she was constantly having to change her life and change her career and change kind of her outlook. And she was constantly feeling like Ceridwen was angry with her because she was feeling like she was a disappointment. So then we started to look at the story of what is Ceridwen actually doing when she's chasing Taliesin. She's not just flowing and trying to be vengeful to destroy him. She is the exact opposite of what he is in the moment in order to keep him moving forward. She is a deity of change in that moment, catalyst of change, right? Now, when we think of and we can apply that to our life, okay, catalyst of change. What are the things that catalyst of change? I've certainly experienced that kind of almost supernatural force that seemed to be guiding me in a direction, but really wanting me to be better than what I actually am, right? Really trying to drive me forward, trying to impress upon me that stagnation is death, right? And Ceridwen is that in that part of the story. And as soon as we worked through this, right? And I can't say that that was all my own, it was very much very like coming from the client too. It was like, oh, so Ceridwen isn't just connected to that lake in Wales. Ceridwen is in my life now. Oh,
Mhm.
right. Yeah.
And that brings it back to why would you read the folk tales from Wales and myths and legends from Wales? Well, it's
Yeah.
because actually those forces of nature are
They have a
all,
timeless, that is the timeless quality.
yeah, and
Yes.
through
Yeah.
that connecting to place, because we're tangible beings, right?
Yes, we are.
We're
Yes.
embodied creatures. So
Yes.
when we read stories, when we listen to stories that are embodied in a location, we
Mhm.
meet the powers behind those
We
locations.
do. Yes,
Yeah.
we do. Yeah, we do. Yeah. In Hinduism, there's this beautiful concept called a Leela. And if anybody's really looked into Vaishnava Krishnaism, um, this idea of the leader, God comes into the world to play. Basically, anytime Vishnu manifests in one of his avatars, he is in the right moment, in the right place to play out a pivotal scene that can be witnessed by humanity, right? And then he goes off and he has his life, his existence somewhere else. But what we focus on is that manifestation of him in that moment. We tease out all of what we can learn from that moment. So
Mm.
God is playing with us, God is playing for us, God is playing to us, God is playing for himself, right? Or herself, whatever it is. But it's that moment that it's like the veil has just been lifted for a bit. We can see a divine play being played out, and then the veil goes back again, and it's up to us to figure it out, you know. And I
Mm.
think that we all have those moments where it's like suddenly like you almost like the synchronicities come together, and you're like, oh, and everything falls into place, right? You know, the pivotal scene where Agatha Christie brings us all together, you know, the whodunit, right? You know, lays it all out for us. And
Mm.
I think that's, for me, that's what living practice actually is being present and being present for those moments. And in the stories of the deities and whatnot, the deities aren't defined by those stories, but the stories are definitely defined by those deities.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So one, like I agree totally, and I love that God comes to play. So one of the things that I wanted to ask you, and I'm just going to squeeze it in before we wrap up,
Mm.
and that was that having now, like you were living in Canada, now you're back here, and you were here previously as well, like before you went to.
Yes, I was. Yes.
So how what is that experience for you? Have you noticed a difference in the experience of working the magic that you work and working with the spirits that you work with? Have you noticed a difference now that you're back here compared to when you were in Canada?
It's funny because 2 weeks ago I was kind of on cloud nine. I had just arrived back home, and for years I've pined to be back home, right? So a little background. I left Wales when I was 8.5 years old, moved to Ontario, Canada, and I didn't fit in very well. I was bullied, it was a strange place, all of that. And and for years, it was like the grass is greener on the other side, right? I connected with friends over here, made, acquaintances, connections, and it was just like, oh, this is my home, you know? And um, I got it into my head because it was a feeling. I got it into my head that I just didn't have a connection with Ontario. And I can honestly say that that's not true anymore. Like I really do. Like in absence, the heart does grow fonder. I've realized what that relationship actually was, and how much of that was my own lenses up front. So it's been an interesting journey because many of the deities that I work with, I encountered in my life in Ontario, in my life in North America, because they're intrinsic to life itself, right? They're not grounded to any particular place. Or they were, I should say, but they've evolved and I relate to them differently. So coming back to the UK, when I was in Wales, I stayed in Wales in Wrexham for 4 days, and it was lovely. Like it was so familiar. The voices, like the accent, very familiar. And it was just, it felt very comfortable. It felt like home. It felt like a homecoming. And as a friend came up to get me and brought me back down to Northampton here, as we crossed over the border, it was like an energetic shift. But the energetic shift was because of the landscape shifted. right? So suddenly, like you're coming out of like the Clwydyn Range, you're coming into the plains of Shropshire there, and Shropshire is a beautiful country. Don't get me wrong, it's a gorgeous country, but it is a lot flatter than the hills behind us, right? And you feel that. And I came to Wellingborough, and it wasn't what I expected because it felt very dead. It felt like too little butter spread on too much bread,
Mm.
right? Yeah, it felt like this place was very depressed. It felt like this was very downtrodden. It felt like there was an energy here that was product of history, let's be honest. The Midlands, and particularly this part of the Midlands, has been kind of lower class for a long time because for a long time it was industry. And the landscape, certain parts of the landscape are gorgeous, but friends like we went to the Wheelwright Stones in Oxfordshire the other day, and it was like, oh, suddenly it felt vibrant, it felt alive, it felt like there were things watching us. Whereas around here, it feels a little bit more somber, right? So I've been trying to be very humble and careful entering into this landscape again because it's almost like the prodigal son coming back again after all these years. But I know that in my relationship, I had a certain projection to it, and so I'm looking forward to really connecting in a real way now I'm over here. What I'm really interested in is how my druidry kind of expands or doesn't expand. That was a block for me because reading the stories, reading your Mabinogi, reading stories of like, the well, a lot of it, like the Arthurian texts, all of this, right? Like I recognize and I know the landscape, right? Yeah, I've been to some of these sites that are in these books. So for me, that was a block whenever I was going through the OBOD course, for example, because the stories, I couldn't connect with them in proxy. I could, I feel like I could only really connect with them in person, right?
Mm.
And the initiation piece was always a bit challenging for me. So I'm going to reinitiate in this landscape, in this land, and I think that will be powerful. But yeah, I'm still figuring it out. I hope that long-winded diatribe answered the question somewhat, but I'm still kind of figuring it out. Yeah, it's been an adjustment. Yeah.
It's really fascinating to me how our understanding and our beliefs about place
Yes.
impact on our ability or not to connect.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
So,
Yeah.
and it's like you're talking about the place, too little butter spread on too much bread. Um, I where I grew up, Swindon is it's
Oh, Swindon. Yeah.
yeah. I mean,
Yeah.
it's lots of people in Britain know it because they've been through it on the train or past it on the motorway, right? It's a
Yes.
commuter town, basically. It's a very large town. It's large enough to be a city, but it isn't because it doesn't have the infrastructure. It doesn't have the culture, the qualities for
Yeah.
being a city. It doesn't meet the criteria. Um, but what it is, it's a cheap place to live that is easy to commute to Reading, which is a big city, to London, even to Bristol, to Oxford, further south. It's a really good location. But what that means is that the people who work and the people who have things going on in their lives, they live around the edge or the really nice parts of the town, and then they go elsewhere for fun, for work, for whatever. And the people that are left, like myself growing up there, are the people who don't have access to transport, who don't have a lot of money, or who are young and therefore
Mm-hmm.
stuck there. So it's people who
Yes.
are basically stuck there.
Yes.
And so it's kind of got this really heavy, and I love that image of too little butter on too much bread.
Mm.
It's spread very thin. I always used to describe it as a black hole. And the landscape around it is gorgeous.
Totally.
Avebury is
Mm-hmm.
just down the road, right? Marlborough is this beautiful little village. There's all these gorgeous, gorgeous places. Now, while I was living there, I was just like, this place is just so, mm, ugh.
Yeah.
And I was exploring paganism and connecting in with the magic and finding it really challenging
Yeah.
to feel the enchantment there, because it just felt like a black hole.
Yes.
But what that did for me was it meant that I worked really hard on recognizing where that magic is in even the most urban of spaces, and even the most like dumbed down, like, yeah, most difficult spaces to find them in. Obviously not the most difficult, not like in a war zone or whatever, but every somewhere you might live your everyday life and go, ugh, there's nothing here. I worked really hard at finding those corners and those spaces, finding the magic that grew up through the cracks, finding the ways to connect, which meant that once I came here, it was so easy. And when I
Right.
talk to other
Right.
people who are like, oh, I can't, I live in the middle of London, I'm like, okay, this is what you can look for.
This is the thing, right? This is the thing. And I think that that is, I mean, that is a perfect encapsulation of what we've been talking about is, it's like that old saying, wherever you are, there you are,
Yeah.
right?
And it
It,
shapes you and you learn
and it
from it.
shapes you.
Yeah.
Yeah. But if you're constantly trying to see other landscapes, right, and pine for those other landscapes, and I think this is perhaps part of my own journey is, the landscape and the place that I was pining for was Britain of 30 years ago, right? I went through, and I'm still going through those feelings of culture shock because it's no longer that place. It's 30 years further on. We diverged from our experience, our relationship together. So now it's, well, what is this? What is my practice connected to this place? What is this place? What is this? And as you say, right, working really hard to recognize what is in front of you. And a lot of the work is really going through your own kind of expectations and what it feels like and what it looks like, right?
And
You know,
remembering that you have grown up since you were 8.5 years old. So you are no
very
longer the
much
same
so.
person either. Yeah.
No. And
Yeah.
that's exactly it. And so to bring this back to, again, story, this is where I think that listeners can do the hard work is whenever you are reading folklore, folk tale, folk story, understanding that those are snapshots of
Mm.
a particular time. One of the things that I was very intentional with in my book was to show how the story has evolved over time by showing and literally printing out the iterations of the story over and over and over again to demonstrate that stories can change and grow even with a span of a few generations and the reasons why those change, right? Whether it be outside influences by writers who are trying to infuse with more interesting elements, right? Literary critics or English folk, who are trying to, like add in motifs or, strengthen or bring out something, or the communities where, it doesn't, the stories don't make so much sense with this element there, but it does make sense if it's shifted. I'll give you a very good example of that, right? And I think this is why paganism, again, not being critical, but paganism sets itself up in a somewhat of a damaging way because we approach stories in the same way that Christianity approaches the Bible. This is rote. This is the orthodoxy. This is the true edition. So when we read the definitive, translation of a Mabinogi or of these, skaldic poetry of the Prose Edda or whatever it is, we're looking at that and being like, okay, this is the version. That is the true
In the
version
book.
in the book.
Yeah.
And like a friend of mine in Ontario, and I think you actually know him, Brian Walsh, he's fabulous. He did for his master's thesis like 20 years ago, he went through the Secret Commonwealth and he translated the Secret Commonwealth. Anyways, he is of an Irish background like 100 years ago, 200 years ago. And I love him so much, but he made a very good point. He said, when pagans in Ireland, his experience is when pagans in Ireland go into those stories and read them, there are scenes where they talk about the forests of Ireland. Well, Ireland doesn't have forests the same way they did, 1,000 years ago.
Mhm.
So, to a modern Irish view, that doesn't make sense. But for him, as a diaspora Irish person, it does make sense because all of Northern Ontario is a vast forest that goes on for days and days. So, for him, his way of connecting with that landscape is with his own landscape,
Mm.
right? That's
Really.
why it needs to change and to be updated and to evolve and grow to be in the present now. This is why I really love whenever, like the BBC or ITV or whatever, do kind of modern versions of like Shakespeare or the Canterbury Tales. There was a beautiful series of the Canterbury Tales about 10 or 12 years ago, and they were six mini plays basically, but they were set in modern Britain, and it was fantastic. Like Julie Walters as the wife of Bath, but she's like, a prima donna singer who is like, has multiple, affairs and whatnot. And it's fabulous, right? And the story makes sense when you set it in that way, right? Yeah. So yeah, evolution.
I'm gonna look those up.
I'll send it to you. It's so good. It's so
Yeah,
good.
please do. No, that'd be
Yeah.
really cool. And I like this is a really important topic for me as a storyteller. So
Mhm.
obviously there are cultures of storytelling where remembering the details and getting the details right is really important.
Yes,
And
very
that's
important.
right. That's a storyteller as law keeper. There are traditions.
Yes. Yeah.
But for most storytellers, for the storytelling space that I come from as
Hmm.
well, it is very much about you're exploring the stories, and when you tell them, the emphasis changes, the pieces change, the version that you've woven it together from, you're
Yeah.
drawing maybe on multiple different places, you're recontextualizing it into place or into
Yes.
time. And the thing that I always come back to, because there's lots of people like, oh, you shouldn't change the stories. I'm like, well, there are 300 different versions of this story. Which one is the
Hmm.
one that is precious? But
Hmm.
also, if I tell you a version of this story and it resonates with you now,
Hmm.
and then you tell that story and it resonates with the person you tell it to, and you're sharing it,
Very much so.
that story holds its magic, its medicine for us in this time and place.
Very
And
much
those
so.
changes will continue on. And if I change something and it doesn't resonate with anyone else, well, then it will fade away and it won't be kept, right? And those changes, they happen naturally and they are kept when they matter. And when they don't, yeah.
I think this is where we bring in the whole cultural appropriation piece, because
Yes.
what you just explained there is an organic in culture process of
Mm-hmm.
evolution of a story, right? You are in your cultural setting, you understand that the story needs to change to make sense to the audience that you're talking to. You're making organic changes that are relatable and understandable. And if they don't, if the audience doesn't like it or it's too extreme of a change, then it'll fade and forget. That is the natural way that folklore and story telling it operates,
Yeah.
right? Where cultural appropriation comes in is an outsider coming in and saying, I don't understand this element here, so I'm just going to change it willy-nilly without understanding the reason of that thing. Now, that being said, this is also where it's different with cultural diffusion, because if a story comes from this culture and moves into this culture and is properly understood, then elements will change in this other culture. But it isn't I'm coming in to change it here and enforce it. That's where cultural appropriation and imperialism is. An outsider coming in, writing the story down or writing a new version of the story and representing it back to the original culture, being this is the true version. That's when it gets damaged,
Yeah.
right? But if we look at, say, and we can see this even in written record, look at the Thousand and One Nights, Arabian Nights tales, right? A lot of those stories originally came from a Persian epic, which actually was an Indian epic for Panchatantra. So the Panchatantra, like, and I love using this example, so I know all the dates, like 2,400 years ago to about 1,800 years ago is when the Panchatantra was formed. That then was taken when the Mughals came in, and the Persian courts loved these stories, but they had to be kind of shifted and changed because, it went from a Hindu context into a Muslim context, right? So a lot of the same animals are there, makes sense. So they just kind of shifted some things. But when it goes to further west, you suddenly get into landscapes where you don't have tigers, you have lions. So certain elements needed to change there. So by the time the 1001 Arabian Nights, which is really the Persian stories, which was really the Panchatantra, comes into Europe and gets translated and then finds its way into the Canterbury Tales, because there's a few Canterbury Tales which actually are part of that lineage. The details are so different now, but the core elements are still there, so they're still recognizable. But they went through that process of cultural diffusion, right? Very important. There's
Yeah.
processes to all of this.
Yeah, that's a really beautiful illustration and a really important distinction to make. And there are a couple of stories that I've been told that really had an impact on me, but I was told them in this actually belongs to, like, there's one recently that a friend told me, that a storytelling friend told a small group of us and said, look, I have been given permission to share this to a point. But this is a Maori tale from a particular group of people who have taken
Mm,
me in. So I'm like, it hit me, the story hit me so hard, like it's imprinted in my soul. I could tell you it now. I can remember every bit of it, but it's not my story to tell. And I wouldn't take that, like I couldn't take that story as like a model and rewrite it, because my storytelling show, The Goblin Circus, I take European folk tales and change aspects of them, rewrite them, what have you, in order to like give them a twist, make them playful,
mhm.
bring them into the circus. Right, that's part of the way they work. Well, I wouldn't do that with this, because this is not my story to tell. It was a gift that I have received and has had an impact on me. And that's something that we have to be very mindful of, entitlement. And
Yes, very
that's
much so.
because we are and I always bring it back to, we are in relationship with the stories, relationship with the spirits, relationship with other people. And if something is entrusted to us as a moment, as a gift,
Mm.
that doesn't mean that it's ours then to do with as we will.
This is the thing. Yeah.
Yeah.
And this is why I think the norm around the world has been that when a story comes from outside, when a story is told by a merchant who's passing through, and the story has gravitas, this is why it's often then landed into the landscape here, because
Mm,
then it becomes our story, because it's part of the landscape that we're in. But that process is over time, right?
yeah.
Um, you know, and oftentimes it's because the story is really very similar or has very similar features to a story that has already existed here. We see this with saints' tales, right? Whenever you see foreign saints like Saint St. George. There we go. Can you imagine being in England and forgetting the St. George? Can you imagine that? And like not even a block away from St. George Arms. Like what is this, you know? North American brain here. But look at St. George, right? There are so many places in England. There's like at least 4 or 5 places in England that swear that this was the site where St. George slew his dragon.
Yeah.
Meanwhile, the historical St. George never came here, but that's the power of the landing. And as soon as it's landed,
Mm-hmm.
right, it becomes part of here, it becomes our story. But that's cultural exchange, that's cultural diffusion. That's not, going off into Anatolia, stealing the story and coming back because nope, you know, the
Yeah.
difference. Yeah.
Yeah. And I mean, here's the thing as well. Sometimes we can get so cautious, so overly cautious about
Mhm.
things, that we police ourselves and stop that natural process of
Yes,
exchange, of communication, or we try and stop other people from doing it because we're like, no, 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 we can't. And it's like, we will sometimes make mistakes,
totally. We
right?
totally do. Hmm.
Absolutely. But
Yes.
the way that we can navigate this as modern pagans with, I believe the way that we can navigate this as modern pagans with this, with all of our background, with the way that we've been brought up, like that kind of the Christian influence, the
Hmm.
capitalist, the all of these things, is to try and be present with each other, to try our best to
Hmm.
listen, and to pay attention to ourselves and look at whether we're being entitled or whether we are
Mm.
doing our best to be respectful. And
Yes.
if we mess up, then we try to make it right. We apologize. We go, oh, I messed up. I'm going to do better. Because messing up isn't being a bad person.
No. No,
right?
it isn't. No,
It's
it
what you
isn't.
do after that that
No.
is. Yeah. So, yeah. Oh, this has been a gorgeous, gorgeous conversation.
I
And
really enjoyed this. Thank you,
yeah,
Halo, for having me.
well,
Yeah.
thank you for being here and coming and joining me. We've gone a little longer than I said we would, but I think it's some really, really important, really interesting topics. So I very much appreciate it.
Thank you.
Now, as always, I like to ask my guests, because I've just remembered actually we're recording a podcast, we're not just um, I like to ask my guests to share something practical that our listeners can go away and do. So, what do you have for people to go away and try after this?
So this is very much about the home as as a spiritual landscape, right? This goes back thousands of years, but it's no, I've noticed it's not something that a lot of books will talk about, you know. Um, I'm sure that some of our colleagues have talked about it. It's just not coming to me right now. But it's basically treating the landscape of the home as a ritual space. And I don't mean performing, you know, ritual where you're putting on robes or you're lighting candles or anything like that, but more about respecting the space and the spirits in this space. So I like to call it, I like to call it, well, in the languages that I use, I call it home puja, but basically honoring the home, right? And what you do is you research in your area. You look at in your area what is the kind of a traditional way of a floor sweeping concoction, right? Some places they use certain herbs, some, you know, that were used for cleaning. Others have like a family secret, like, you know, a little bit of lemon in with, you know, like whatever it is, you know, Windex and a little bit of water and whatnot, right? And what you're essentially doing is you're honoring the home. So you start at the threshold of the door. You go into your front door and you start to wash the front step, so the literal threshold of the home, and and as you're washing it, you invite the spirit of that threshold to come for a bath, to enjoy a moment with you, and just spend time acknowledging that this is the threshold to your inner domestic space, that it's guarded, that there is a spirit there watching and waiting and being present, and that you are honoring that spirit by washing the front step. This is something that actually is very, or was very common in the north where my parents come from. So they weren't necessarily thinking of it in an animistic sense, but like, you know, front door washing was and front step washing was a big thing, particularly in row houses, in, you know, mill cities and industrial towns, because that's where it would just get dirty so much. And so for pride of home, you would often see, you know, the housewives going and washing the steps because, God forbid, you know, the gentleman would do it. So it's that sense of, you know, honoring the threshold. Then you move into each room and you again wash down the threshold to that space. The threshold is really the portal to that room. There is a spirit in that room. And you just take a moment to experience that space, right? The kitchen is very easy because we have so many hearth deities, right? The kitchen makes sense. It's where we go to eat and feed ourselves, right? But what about the storage room where you store things that you are no longer right needing right now, but you want to keep, right? What is the going to the bathroom, for example, and spending time in that space? What about the spare bedroom if you're lucky enough to have a spare bedroom? Right? The spirit of that room, the egregore of that room, the genius loci of that room is this is where your guests come to relax. This is creating the opportunity for your friends to come and spend time with you, right? You know. And then so you work your way through your home and you just be in that moment with that spirit of that place, right? You may want to, if you want to, you know, have a small shrine set up, maybe you get a little figure and place that figure representative of that spirit of that room in the room itself, right? Or you might have a small central shrine in the corridor as you're coming in, with the figures of each representing each of the rooms in the house, and then you exit into the garden or you exit into the back space, if you're lucky to. Pardon me, if you're lucky to have that. If you live in a flat and you have a balcony, it's exiting into the balcony. And if you don't, if you live in a flat and you only have one entrance and one exit, then you do the circulation of the space and you come back out through the front door, which is really your exit. And you then take a moment to thank the space that you're in. So there's no need to smudge or light anything. You're just washing and giving it a good scrub and just spending time with the space. Yeah.
I love that. Thank you.
You're welcome. You're
Yeah.
welcome. Yeah.
Yeah. And so a home ritual, home honoring. That's a really, feels like a really powerful piece that sort of ties in so much of what we've talked about place and about story and about recognizing those unknown stories of the deities, the beings as the thresholds, guardians of the thresholds as well. Maybe getting to know their stories. Yeah.
Yeah, very much so. Yeah. To leave off on, I mean, if we think of the spaces that we inhabit now as the arenas of future folklore, right? You know, how many times, like if we think about our funerals, right? What are the stories and what are the places of those stories that are going to be told at our funerals when we're gone, right? Every moment can be a mythic moment if we make it, right?
That is a perfect quote to end on. Every moment can be a mythic moment if we make it.
There we go.
Thank
I'm
you.
going to have that on a t-shirt, I think.
I think you
Thank you. No,
should.
thank
Yeah.
you.
And then sell it for that.
Yes. Yes.
To allow people to support you and your valuable service to the community and writing your books and sharing those things that you uncover. Where can people pre-order your book, other than I will put the link below, but where can people find Of Doves and Ravens and your other works? Where can people find you? Where can people seek you out as a pagan friendly therapist? If you're are you open for clients at the moment?
I am, yes. So I am open for clients. I'm open to UK clients only. I'm not taking any North Americans anymore. And they can find me at benstimpsoncounseling.co.uk. And my main author website is benstimpson.com. So most of it's just plug my name to Google, Ben Stimpson Counselor or Ben Stimpson Author, and you'll come up with one of those.
Beautiful.
Yeah.
Thank you. And Of Doves and Ravens will be available hopefully from
Yes.
September, but you can go and pre-order it now. Please, folks, go and pre-order it if you want a copy, and I highly recommend it. As I say, I have already read it, and I will be getting myself one of the beautiful hardback versions, given half a chance, because
1999. It's 1999, so it's very, very affordable for
very affordable.
a beautiful hardback book. Yeah.
Yeah. So definitely go and pre-order it, because pre-orders really do help authors. Yeah, thank you so much, Ben.
Thank you.
Thank you to the spirits of story and place and all of the gods and goddesses and deities mentioned, and all of the beings and tales and cultures and all of those threads that have been present in this conversation. You are know that you are honored here, as they say at Druid Camp, and that's a phrase that I have adopted because I adore it.
And Druid Camp is happening very just a little bit north from where I am this year. So
Brilliant!
It's up in Market Harborough area. They're not giving out the exact place, but that's where they're doing it.
Well, I'm going to be teaching there, teaching a workshop there. So if you're there, I'll see you there.
Maybe I'm not sure. We'll see, but enjoy.
I will indeed. So thank you to our listeners. Please do that practice of home honoring in whatever way makes sense. Come and share your experiences with it. Share your floor wash cleaning recipes, and say where it is that you live and where these recipes are from, so that we can see what the similarities and differences are and inspire each other. And come, and also I'd love to read from people. What is your favorite local folk tale that is in the place? So come and add, like, put a comment wherever it is you found this, or come and join us in the Enchanted Academy, link below, to actually share what your favorite folk tale that is local to you is, if you have one. And if you don't, then maybe you might want to go and find one. Until next time, thank you. May your path be enchanted. May your world be filled with story. And may the local tales come and knock on your door in the best of ways. Take care, everybody. Goodbye.